The first time I died, it wasn't dramatic. No car crash. No hospital monitors flatlining in a frenzy. Just a slow erosion of everything I thought I had chosen wisely. I stood in the corner of a Manhattan penthouse during my sister's anniversary party, watching city lights bleed against the glass like spilled gold, and realized that my life had been defined by fear disguised as practicality. My sister, Amelia Cross, stood at the center of the room in a scarlet dress, her hand resting possessively on the arm of Lucas Ashford, the billionaire venture capitalist whose name appeared in financial magazines and political donor lists with equal frequency. He was magnetic in a way that bent rooms toward him. Years ago, he had asked me to marry him. I had refused, unsettled by the sharpness in his eyes, by the way he seemed to evaluate rather than adore. I told myself I wanted something softer, kinder, safer, so I married David Howley instead. David was steady, thoughtful, a respected financial compliance attorney with clean hands and a gentle voice. I believed I was choosing peace. I believed love would grow from stability. Instead, I found myself watching my sister ascend into a world of private jets and international summits while my marriage quietly thinned into polite distance. David worked long hours investigating corporate misconduct, ironically, sometimes brushing dangerously close to Lucas's financial empire without realizing it. I saw the tension in him long before headlines began to whisper about federal probes into Ashford Holdings. And when those whispers turned into formal investigations, when subpoenas started moving through corridors David walked every day, I understood something terrifying. My husband was being positioned as the face of a case that would make powerful enemies. The night he died, it was ruled an accident. A late-night collision on a rain-slicked highway. No witnesses. No clear explanation. Just a grieving widow and a city that moved on too quickly. At the funeral, Lucas stood beside Amelia, his expression solemn but unreadable. He met my eyes across the gravesite with something that felt disturbingly like recognition. As if he knew that I understood more than I could prove. 3 months later, I received a thin envelope containing anonymous bank records, transfers routed through shell companies, payments that coincided too neatly with investigative milestones. I never made it to the press conference I had planned. I collapsed in my apartment the night before, my heart giving out under the weight of grief and fury that had nowhere to go. When I opened my eyes again, I was 23 years old, standing in my mother's kitchen while she argued with Amelia about Lucas Ashford's dinner invitation. The air smelled of basil and fresh paint. My phone buzzed in my hand with a message from Lucas himself. "I'd like to see you tonight. Alone." In my first life, I had declined that invitation gently, almost nervously. This time I stared at the message and felt memory sharpen into something colder than anger. I remembered the envelope. The shell companies. The rain-slicked highway. Upstairs, Amelia was laughing too brightly, already enamored by Lucas's reputation. She had always gravitated toward power the way moths gravitate toward flame, convinced she could control the burn. In our first life, she only pursued him after I stepped back. She liked winning, but she loved stealing. If I showed interest this time, she would pivot instantly. That had always been our rhythm, her desire intensified by my hesitation. I considered the possibilities carefully. I could accept Lucas, step into his world, gather evidence from the inside. Or I could step aside again, allow her to marry him, and choose a different battlefield altogether. I chose the battlefield. That night at dinner, Lucas watched me with calculating fascination, the same sharp intelligence I remembered cutting through polite conversation like glass. He spoke of markets and expansion, of strategic acquisitions and regulatory negotiations, testing my reactions with subtle precision. I responded thoughtfully, but without surrender, allowing him to see just enough curiosity to keep him engaged. Amelia, seated across from us, noticed every glance. By dessert, her posture had shifted, shoulders straighter, laughter brighter, eyes fixed on him with competitive hunger. When he offered to drive me home, I declined with a soft smile and thanked him for the evening. It was all Amelia needed. Within weeks, she positioned herself as indispensable to him, adapting her interests to mirror his, studying financial jargon the way other women studied fashion. Lucas predictably enjoyed the pursuit. While Amelia ascended into Lucas's orbit, I made a decision that would have terrified the younger version of myself. Instead of marrying for comfort, I enrolled in law school with a singular focus: federal prosecution. Not corporate compliance like David had practiced, but criminal financial enforcement. I immersed myself in statutes and case law, in the architecture of corruption, and the weaknesses men like Lucas believed were invisible. It was not revenge that fueled me, at least not solely. It was clarity. In my first life, I had watched from the outside, powerless to intervene. In this one, I intended to stand where power was exercised deliberately. Years unfolded differently. Amelia married Lucas in a ceremony that dominated business pages, her smile luminous with triumph. I attended, composed and observant, memorizing the faces of his board members, the quiet exchanges between attorneys and investors. Lucas approached me once during the reception, his expression tinged with something like curiosity. "You would have thrived beside me," he said quietly. I met his gaze without flinching. "I thrive wherever I choose," I replied. It unsettled him more than rejection ever had. By 30, I had secured a position within a federal task force investigating high-level financial crimes. Ashford Holdings had not yet been indicted, but its name circulated in confidential memos with increasing frequency. Patterns emerged: strategic donations shielding regulatory scrutiny, competitors quietly dismantled through hostile takeovers engineered with surgical ruthlessness. None of it was illegal on the surface. That was Lucas's genius. He operated within margins, exploiting ambiguity rather than breaking laws outright. But genius leaves fingerprints. It always does. Amelia's calls became less frequent over time. At first, she reveled in private islands and curated philanthropy. But I heard the strain beneath her voice during rare late-night conversations. Lucas was attentive when it suited him, distant when it did not. He treated relationships like assets, valuable, but ultimately transactional. She once confided that he tracked conversations the way he tracked investments, evaluating loyalty against utility. I listened without judgment. I had warned her in another life without success. This time I said nothing. The breakthrough in our investigation arrived unexpectedly, buried in an offshore transaction flagged by an analyst barely 2 years out of college. The routing pattern echoed the anonymous bank records I remembered receiving before my first death. My pulse steadied instead of racing. This was not shock. It was confirmation. I volunteered to lead the subcommittee analyzing the data, careful not to reveal personal history. Evidence accumulated: gradually layered shell corporations, strategic timing, quiet payouts to silence potential whistleblowers. And beneath it all, a structure elegant enough to impress even those who sought to dismantle it. The day federal agents executed search warrants at Ashford Holdings headquarters, Amelia called me in hysterics. "They're saying it's political," she insisted. "They're saying competitors are framing him." I remained measured, reminding her that investigations follow evidence, not envy. She demanded reassurance I could not provide. When news broke that Lucas himself was under formal inquiry for conspiracy and obstruction, I felt neither satisfaction nor grief, only inevitability. He requested to see me once charges were filed. Not as a defendant bargaining for mercy, but as a strategist confronting an equal. We met in a secure interview room, fluorescent lights flattening the charisma that once filled penthouses. He studied me with narrowed eyes. "You could have had this life," he said, voice low. "Instead, you chose to build the case against it." I folded my hands calmly. "No," I replied. "I chose to ensure no one else dies because of it." His expression shifted then, not guilt, not quite fear, but recognition. He had always admired intelligence sharpened by resolve. What unsettled him was realizing that I had forged mine beyond his influence. Amelia stood by him publicly until the indictment became unavoidable. When plea negotiations began, she withdrew from headlines, retreating from a world that no longer glittered. The day Lucas was sentenced, she did not attend court. I did, not out of vengeance but closure. As the judge recited findings of calculated manipulation and financial coercion, I felt the weight of my first life settle into something lighter. David's death had not been erased by rebirth, but it had not been meaningless either. After the verdict, Amelia approached me outside the courthouse, her composure fractured for the first time since childhood. "Did you always plan this?" she asked hoarsely. I considered the question carefully. No, I said truthfully. I plan to never be powerless again. She studied me with something between resentment and reluctant admiration. For once, she had not stolen the brighter future. She had chased power without understanding its cost. And I had chosen to stand where power answers to law. In my first life, I believed marriage defined destiny. In my second, I learned that destiny belongs to the one willing to confront it directly. I did not remarry immediately. I did not rush toward romance to replace what I had lost. Instead, I built something steadier than wealth and sharper than revenge: autonomy. And this time, when I stood beneath the Manhattan skyline, watching lights shimmer against glass, nothing about them felt fragile. The collapse did not begin with a headline. It began with a whisper, the kind that moves through boardrooms before it ever reaches the public. In my first life, I had watched Nathaniel Cross build his empire like a man stacking glass towers during an earthquake, balancing ambition on leverage so precarious it made regulators nervous but investors greedy. In that life, when the investigation came, it had been swift and merciless. The Securities Commission raided at dawn, analysts withdrew support by noon, and by evening his stock price had fallen so violently that even loyalty could not cushion the impact. Victoria had been photographed leaving their penthouse in sunglasses too large for her face, chin lifted in defiance while everything behind her fractured. I remembered the sound of her screaming at him through the phone when accounts were frozen. I remembered the divorce filing before the bankruptcy paperwork was complete. And I remembered how she told everyone she had been misled, as though ignorance were innocence. But in this life, I did not wait for collapse. I prepared for it. Marrying Alexander Reed had not been an act of revenge. That was the narrative Victoria preferred. That I had aligned myself with Nathaniel's most disciplined competitor out of jealousy or spite. The truth was less dramatic and far more dangerous. Alexander did not gamble on expansion. He engineered inevitability. His firm specialized in acquisitions that looked like rescues and ended as absorption. Where Nathaniel thrived on spectacle, glossy interviews, philanthropic galas, bold announcements, Alexander preferred silence, regulatory compliance so airtight it bored journalists, and strategic patience that unnerved anyone who mistook restraint for weakness. In my first life, I had admired him from afar without understanding the architecture of his influence. In this one, I stood beside him at midnight strategy sessions, reading financial disclosures line by line, mapping vulnerabilities no one else noticed, because they were too busy admiring Nathaniel's charisma. Victoria mistook charisma for invincibility. She always had. The first public crack appeared during an earnings call. Nathaniel's tone faltered when analysts pressed about offshore partnerships. It was subtle. A half-second pause, a slight tightening around the mouth, but I recognized it because I had heard it before. Afterward, Victoria called me under the pretense of sisterly concern. Her voice dipped in artificial sweetness as she asked whether Alexander's firm had any interest in expanding into emerging tech infrastructure. I knew what she was really asking. Was her husband safe? I gave her the truth wrapped in civility. Alexander expands where stability allows, I told her. Instability creates opportunity, but only for those prepared to manage it. She did not like that answer. It sounded too much like prophecy. Behind the scenes, regulators were circling again. Not because of sabotage. I would never cheapen my second life with illegality. But because Nathaniel had never learned moderation. Growth fueled him the way oxygen fuels fire. Without constant expansion, he felt diminished. He leveraged assets to fund acquisitions that looked brilliant on quarterly reports and reckless under forensic review. In my first life, I had tried to warn Victoria, but she dismissed me as resentful. This time, I said nothing. Warning someone who mistakes arrogance for intelligence is a futile kindness. The raid happened on a gray Tuesday morning. News helicopters hovered above Crossdeck headquarters while commentators speculated breathlessly about fraud investigations and compliance failures. Victoria was inside when federal agents arrived. She called me from a private office, her composure splintering through the speaker, as she demanded to know whether Alexander had orchestrated this humiliation. There it was, the accusation she had been nurturing for years. I almost pitied her. If your husband's foundation was sound, I replied evenly, No competitor could shake it. Silence met that statement, heavy and suffocating. She understood then that this was not a duel between men. It was the inevitable consequence of choices made long before either of us were reborn. Nathaniel fought publicly. Press conferences. Legal rebuttals. Defiant speeches about innovation being punished by bureaucracy. But markets are not moved by pride. They are moved by confidence. And confidence, once cracked, rarely reseals. Investors began withdrawing. Partnerships dissolved quietly. Suppliers renegotiated terms. Within weeks, Crosstech's valuation bled into numbers that looked unreal even to seasoned analysts. Through it all, Alexander remained composed, issuing statements about industry stability and responsible leadership, never once mentioning Nathaniel by name. It was surgical. It was clean. It was devastating. Victoria came to my house one evening without calling ahead. She stood in my foyer like someone who had miscalculated gravity, her designer coat hanging looser than it once had, her eyes rimmed red from nights without sleep. For the first time since childhood, she did not arrive to compete. She arrived to plead. "You knew," she said, voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "You knew this would happen." I did not deny it. There is a cruelty in pretending ignorance when truth is obvious. "I remembered," I corrected softly. "There is a difference." She stared at me as if I had confessed to witchcraft. Perhaps in her mind, foresight was indistinguishable from manipulation. "What do you want?" she whispered finally. The question surprised me. In my first life, I had wanted validation, to prove that choosing stability over spectacle was wisdom, not cowardice. In this one, I wanted something simpler and infinitely harder. Peace. "Nothing," I answered. "I chose my path. You chose yours." It was not triumphant. It was not vindictive. It was final. Nathaniel's resignation as CEO came months later, framed publicly as a strategic transition. Privately, it was surrender. Crosstech was absorbed through a complex acquisition structure that placed Alexander's firm in controlling position, not a hostile takeover. Not a public execution, a quiet erasure. The man Victoria had chosen for his brilliance now worked under the governance policies of the husband she had dismissed as second best in another life. That irony did not require commentary. It lived in every board decision, every compliance review, every restrained press release that bore Alexander's signature. The divorce filing arrived shortly after. Victoria could endure financial loss. She could not endure diminished status. But this time, there was no untouched fortune waiting to cushion her fall. Asset freezes, legal settlements, reputation damage, they all followed her like shadows. When she met me for coffee weeks later, she no longer wore armor made of confidence. She wore exhaustion. "You won," she said flatly. I studied her across the table and felt something unexpected. Not victory, not satisfaction, but release. "No," I replied. I remembered. That was the true difference between our lives. In the first, I had mistaken proximity to power for power itself. In the second, I understood that influence built quietly is influence that endures. Victoria chased spectacle twice. I chose structure once. And when the dust settled, it was not revenge that defined the outcome. It was alignment. She had taken the billionaire I rejected. But she had never understood that wealth without foundation is only height without depth. And depth is what survives the fall.